Hi, how are you, Tanya?
Hello,
How's it going?
how are you?
Pretty good, pretty good. Thanks for chatting with me today. I appreciate it. So, for those who are watching, this is Tanya's new book. It's part of the Classroom Essentials series, and it's called Vocabulary Development Across the Day. And for anyone who teaches writing, they obviously know that vocabulary is super important. So I want to start with the book and then shift into a way to talk a little bit more about vocabulary in the remote setting, since so many schools now, not just across the United States, but across the world are, shutting down because of COVID-19. I think even if one school district hasn't shut down, it's a good idea to prepare for that because most likely it's going to go into that world. So let's dive in. So in chapter 2, you talked a little bit about the vocabulary gate, which I thought was a great analogy. For educators who haven't read your book yet, could you talk a little bit more about the way that a limited vocabulary can act like a lock gate and its limits for comprehension?
Yeah, so usually what I do, and actually I go through this a little bit in the book, is actually have people try to read a passage where there are a lot of challenging vocabulary for them. I tend to go scour physics textbooks because not everyone has an extensive physics vocabulary.
No.
And have people just try it and see what it's like to try to read a passage where there are a lot of words where you don't know the meaning. And the challenge, of course, is if there are too many words where you don't know the meaning, the whole text is not going to be meaningful to you. And so I often use the analogy of a gate, right? It really locks comprehension, right? You're on one side of the gate, comprehension's on the other side of the gate. And unless you start to understand something about that vocabulary and maybe the concepts that the words represent, you're stuck. But if we can open that up a little bit, we can get through the text and hopefully be able to comprehend it a little better. So that's usually why I use the gate. And the other big idea related to that is we really can't decode ourselves through the gate, right? Even if you can pronounce the words beautifully, if you don't know what they mean, you're going to be really stuck. And
Right.
we can't use some of the typical decoding and comprehension strategies that we teach to get through the gate. Saying just reread it, that's not really going to help. Ask yourself some questions. Maybe you can make some inferences. That's not really gonna help if there are a lot of words that are hard to understand.
Sure, sure. Yeah, no, I just thought it was such a stellar analogy. I was like, "Ugh, I need to ask her about this because I think that people can really benefit from understanding what that is and why that vocabulary instruction is so critical. So I've always been from the school of thought where I think it's better to teach kids writing terminology, like the word thesis statement, rather than just calling it an idea that you're trying to prove, or dialogue rather than saying it's a conversation between two people. On the same note, like I've noticed like jargon doesn't necessarily work. I've had kids tell me, I'm doing show don't tell, but they don't know what that actually means. They just know it's something that their teacher wants them to do. So, could you talk about why sophisticated terminology matters when teaching young children, and how can teachers work towards making um, writing terms accessible rather than just things that kids will parrot back without understanding the meaning behind them?
Right. So I think there's something to think about sort of big ideas about vocabulary development that might help to answer that question. One is this idea that just because you can say a word doesn't mean you fully understand the concept associated with that word. So we should never assume that because kids can parrot back a word like dialogue, right, or thesis statement actually means they really understand what that is.
Right.
Likewise, they could understand what that is, but not have the correct terminology.
Sure.
So we could be in both of those places or somewhere in between, right? They sort of know what the word means, or they sort of know what you mean when you say.
Right. There's like a developing understanding, but it's not solid yet.
It could be developing both in the label and in the concept.
Mhm.
So we are always wanting to make sure that when we give kids new terminology, we're really digging into the concepts and ideas that those represent, and continuing to revisit that, even if they can say the word, say they're doing it. The other reason I think it's really important to just use the correct terminology with kids is really if they're ready to understand the ideas, they're ready to learn the words. There are no words that kids can't say or can't learn if they're ready to learn the concept. So I'm often in classrooms where people say like, put talkie marks around when somebody's speaking. And I'm just like, just say quotation marks and teach the
Mhm.
kids what a quotation mark actually is. Or for the show, don't tell example, let's look at lots of mentor texts where the author is doing that. And let's try to really figure out what the author is up to and then try that ourselves rather than just saying some words, right? And assuming
Right.
they really know what that means.
Perfect. So in my former life, before I became a literacy consultant, I was a fourth and fifth grade teacher. And in one of the schools I worked in, where I taught fourth grade, there was a huge initiative for vocabulary where we would do interactive read aloud. We had several read alouds across the day. It was a wonderful school to work in terms of like, if you liked literacy and teaching like that, this was the place to be. So our interactive read alouds were in service of our vocabulary instruction. We pulled our words from the interactive read aloud text, which were both chapter books and picture books. And it was really intentionally done. There were a lot of vocabulary games. Like it wasn't just like, here's your list and learn the words. It was very interactive with the kids and it was great. And my students' vocabularies definitely grew as a result of that. Can you talk a bit about how teachers can select text thoughtfully and which books are better for this purpose in K-3, and just how the idea of using read aloud text can then translate into books that you use to help with vocabulary instruction?
Yeah, so I think the wonderful thing with read alouds, particularly in the early years of school where maybe kids' independent reading is purposefully controlled vocabulary, right? Sometimes the words in early readers are kept simple so that when kids can
Right.
decode the word, it connects to a word they already know and they can say, yeah, I read that word. And that's wonderful for that purpose. But read alouds are really the place that we're going to have the opportunity to introduce new words, right? New vocabulary into the classroom space that may not otherwise be there. And that is both in literature and informational texts. We're going to see authors use new vocabulary that kids are unlikely to have in their everyday oral language. So books are a great place to bring new words, right? I always say we learn new words when we learn new things. We learn new words from books. We learn new words from talking to other people who use new words with us, right? Those are pretty much
Right.
so interactive read alouds are going to be really great. If we're having a vocabulary focused interactive read aloud, obviously we have to pick a book that actually has new words that kids are
Mhm.
unlikely to know. So we are actually looking for a book with some sophisticated and challenging words. And that's especially great for the read aloud because the teacher's there to help open the vocabulary gate. We also shouldn't expect that just because we read a word in a book, kids now know that word and can use that word, and as writers and speakers, because it's going to take a little bit more work than that. So overall, we definitely want to pick words with books with new words. It's great to pick texts that can be integrated into learning across the content areas. So
Mhm.
for example, if we're doing a science unit, of course we want to engage kids in explorations where they're doing science, but texts might be a wonderful way to bring some of the the words and vocabulary into that work so that kids have more of the terminology and the technical language to talk about and share their ideas.
Great. So I'm a Peter H. Reynolds fan, so I adore the idea that you had for creating synonym charts using Peter H. Reynolds' book, The Word Collector. Thinking about it maybe a little bit in a remote setting, how might you help students create these charts at home?
Okay, so I think probably I'll first say, just in case people haven't read the book yet, one of my recommendations is that when we read literature, or backing up, when we read literature, there's often a few words in the book that kids don't know, but those words are really connected based on the story in that text. They're not necessarily connected to one another outside of the story. So if we want kids to think about words that are connected to one another, that are closely related in meaning, right? Words that mean happy, words that mean sad, words about how we move our bodies. We're going to need to collect those over time, over multiple texts, right? So if we have an anchor chart, for example, about words that mean happy, over time, as we engage in interactive read alouds, we can keep adding new words that we might find, or as we engage in conversations with people, to that list. And then we have those lists to refer to as writers and as speakers in our classroom. So that's a wonderful thing to do over time. I think there's nothing about that can't happen in a remote setting. If we are still doing interactive read alouds with kids synchronously, we can collect those words. They can be in shared documents, in Google Documents, something that everyone can see and refer to and have access to as a group and add to as a group. We can also ask kids if they, particularly with older kids who might be engaged in book clubs, this is a little beyond the scope of my book, but they can collect words, and add to the class charts or the class shared documents as well. So even in an in-person situation, we may not be able to hang a chart for every single set of synonyms all around our room. So we might want to use a binder or shared documents or other ways of having these resources. I think the main thing is that kids can add, kids can be searching and thinking about words, and that kids can access these actually as resources, particularly for their writing.
I think that's so important, because what I often see are just pages photocopied in kids' folders or binders of synonyms, $1 words, $20 words, whatever it is, and they just live in someone's writing folder or binder, and they're really, I guess they're divorced from like any real meaning. They're just kind of handed out and expected to be used, and I don't see too many kids often referencing those. So I feel like those shared documents, whether you're in a classroom and it's an anchor chart that you're adding to over time, or it's a shared document on Google Drive, I think that's a beautiful way to make it really authentic. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
Is that kids are adding to it. Right?
Yes.
And then when we find a new word and we say, oh, this seems to be another word that means happy, we can actually say, well, how is it the same? How is it different to some of the other words that are already on our list? And let's really consider what are some of the situations, or how is the author using that word? Why is the author using that word? So it's not just about the words themselves. It's about learning something that's, we say, like meta-linguistic knowledge, right? How our language works, to be thinking about things like, there are nuances to word meaning, and sometimes one might be better than the other. And so those are the kinds of conversations that we want to start having, even with our youngest learners.
Yeah, no, I think they're important. In fact, when I read that in your book, I was thinking, I have a daughter who's in 4th grade right now. And I was thinking, you know what, we're starting to read chapter books at night before bedtime. Wouldn't this be a great thing that we can do together to help her? She gets teacher mommy often. So when I read that idea, I was like, oh, this is something that we can do with our reading that will help her in service of her writing and her vocabulary development. So I thought that was a cool idea.
Yeah, I'm teacher mommy too, so they don't
always
want to do my lesson plans, but sometimes I can convince them.
I will tell you, my daughter had like a gratitude activity from where she's doing remote learning for school this year. And she had a gratitude activity this week, and like they had a list, something they were grateful for every day. And on like day 3 or day 4, she wrote, I am grateful for my mom who teaches me. And I was like, I'm not totally messing up. Like sometimes I feel like I'm overbearing, but I'm like, maybe we're okay here. So
That's wonderful.
I don't, that or she couldn't think of anything else. Who knows? But I'll go with the first thought, and because that's more
For sure.
optimistic. So could you talk more about the ways that teachers can make ambitious lists of words to teach, and how they can engage these students with these lists without actually handing out word lists themselves? Um, like for instance, on page 78, I'm just gonna open that up and show that if you don't mind. You know, you have like this concept sort and the word sort. And I just thought, you know, I remember doing this similar with my students. We, you know, kind of use words their way and some other sort resources. Like how could you make that come alive in a remote classroom? Like could you do a screen share to it's not a screen share, like could you do like a Jamboard or something like that to kind of make this come alive for kids?
Yeah. So I'm going to start with backing off the activity itself and
Sure.
thinking about the why we do some of those activities. So
Perfect.
first thing you asked me is about developing lists of words,
Mhm.
and my big thing with that is I definitely want teachers to think about the words that they want kids to learn, particularly when we think about the different content areas. What are the words kids are going to need to read, write, speak, listen, learn, whatever
Mhm.
the content is that's happening in the classroom. I think it's just one way, and one important way to make sure everybody feels included. Everybody has the words they need to express themselves and express their ideas and participate. So when I think about developing word lists, I obviously think about the content I want to teach. I think about the words that are important for that content that we're going to be using a lot or that kids would need to express their ideas. And then I will develop a list of words that I think are important. But
Mhm.
that's really for me as the teacher.
Right.
So that's for, if I know what words I want to make sure kids learn, then I can teach them. So I definitely don't hand the list to the kids. I don't pre-teach all the words for a science unit, for example, because that just doesn't,
It's
it
not
has,
meaningful and it's overwhelming.
well, it's out of context, it's overwhelming. So
Right.
we want to teach words as they're meaningful for kids. Um, so there's the initial teaching of the words. And of course, the best way to learn words is to use them in meaningful ways. So that is, of course, in your speaking, in your writing, to explain ideas. Sometimes we want kids to process words a little more than just using them as speakers and writers,
Mhm.
because there's some reason to organize those words, right? So we want to think about maybe nuances of meaning, or about terms that are used in one domain but differently in another domain. And those are wonderful times to consider sorting activities where kids are actually going to move words around into different organizational structures and try to consider what makes them similar, what makes them
Mhm. Right.
and the manipulating the words is interesting, and part of it, but the why they organize and sharing their ideas is really the most important part. So for me, this is another one of those things that we can do it in a lot of different ways, right? So
Mhm.
we can use, um, you know, there's several different ways where you can make post-it notes online and move them around. Kids
Mhm.
could also print out pictures, cut them out, move them around, take a photo, show their organization and explain why, or take a video and upload that with an explanation. So for me, the how they move the words around is less important than the why they're moving the words around, and how they're thinking about the ideas. So I think there are lots of different ways that we can actually have them manipulate words, whether they're in the classroom or they're in a remote learning environment.
So, switching gears a little bit, meaningful word choice is critical for young writers in order to communicate well. And you talked a bit about encouraging spelling approximations whenever children are attempting to use new vocabulary words in their writing. Could you talk a little bit about how teachers can encourage meaning approximations as well?
Yeah. So of course, spelling approximations are going to help kids to use big words because they don't have to feel like they can spell it. It might be in their oral vocabulary, but they might not know how to spell it. That's
Mhm.
okay. go for it. Use the word and we'll worry about
Right.
editing the spelling later. But the same thing is encouraging kids to try using new words that they might not perfectly know the meaning of. And some of that is just the culture in the classroom, right? If we're talking about words, if we're thinking about word meanings, if we're comparing and contrasting word meanings, and we're encouraging and inviting children to use the big words they know, then that's more likely for kids to try words, even if they don't perfectly know how they mean. But if we're in an environment where we're always correcting or expecting it to be perfect the first time, that's going to be a lot harder. And we've all experienced that, or most of us have experienced that if you've ever been in a foreign language class, whether you're learning a new language, and it's very nerve-wracking to try to use new words because you're worried you
Yeah.
won't use them correctly. In some environments, but other environments, your teacher might have said, just try it, just go for it. What we care about is that you're communicating your ideas, and then you're much more likely to try saying new words or try saying new things. So for me,
Right.
a lot of that is the community that we create in the classroom and how we're really excited about children's ideas and what they have to say, and that words are just part of helping them to get their ideas across.
And I think your foreign language example is really important because a lot of people can relate to that. I'm the I started taking French in third grade, and so I was fluent by the end of high school. But I still remember mixed. I mean, in French, there are several words for one thing, and often I would use the wrong one. And I had this wonderful French teacher for probably 4 or 5 years who was not like, she wasn't a yeller, she wasn't a screamer. If you messed up, she'd be like, no, this that's not the time to use this one, the meaning's off, this is the one that you wanted, this is the word you wanted. And of course I can't think of an example now because I'm very rusty with French. But I do remember that, and I feel like that the way that she fostered that is the way that we want to foster kids in our regular classes, not in foreign language classes, but just, in elementary school. So I think that's a great example.
And I just think it's the enthusiasm and excitement. Wow, you
Sure.
tried to use one of these new words from our list. That's so exciting. And let that be the child's words. And then when we go back and we are revising and editing, that's a good time to maybe share how to use that word more precisely, or
Mhm.
oh, you really need an ing ending because that's how we usually say it in the sentence. We can add to it. That's not
Mhm.
discouraging to give more information. But
No, not at all. That's not discouraging at all. That's helpful.
our first step is like, be excited that we're trying to use new and interesting words in our writing or in our speaking.
And I found when I worked in the school with that vocabulary initiative, the kids were really into it and they really wanted to use those words. And many of my students were English EAL students. And so they were really, this was really hard work for them. And they would get so excited when they used it. And I would get so excited. And it was just like, how many words can I use this week? And of course, some of them never fit, what they were writing, but they were really trying. And I think that kind of enthusiasm is huge when you're doing vocabulary instruction.
I like collect stories where teachers share with me when they've worked with kids and put more focus on vocabulary and encouraged kids to use challenging words, how excited kids are to
They're
actually.
super excited.
And there's really, like I said at the beginning, there's not like a developmental trajectory where we shouldn't
Right.
teach one word if they don't know this earlier one. Kids learn the words that are in their environment. They learn the words
Mhm.
people say around them, and they use them. And they don't really understand necessarily that they're using a challenging word if that's just
Mhm.
that everybody always says. And so that's wonderful. I love to hear kids say interesting and challenging words and really try to be specific and sharing their ideas. Use the words to share their ideas.
Yeah. Well, my son, who's 4, started using the word literally correctly. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I think I used that word too much. And like, he'll just interject it in the middle of a sentence, da 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 da, literally, and then say the rest of it. I'm like, oh my God, like, what have we done here?
Yeah, well, I think that's true, and we've all experienced that as teachers as well, where the children pick up on the phrases that we
Yeah.
say regularly. But that so sometimes that's not a great thing. So we have to watch our phrases that we use. But sometimes that's a wonderful thing because that is like as parents and as teachers, that's a sort of a power that we have
The
to
superpower.
um, put words into kids' environments. Uh,
Right.
so we should take advantage of that.
Yeah. So I have a couple more questions for you before we, close. So since many classrooms are remote or they're going remote now, there isn't like this shared in-person space for kids to access anchor charts, like you shared in your book. And I guess I want to know about what are some ways that you could suggest for like virtual ways for creating charts for kids that model an attention towards word choice.
Yeah. So I really don't think there's one right way to do that. Again, I think it's that it's in a shared space that kids can actually make use of. It's really the same problem we have in the classroom, right? Sometimes you see those anchor charts and they're on the easel and they're buried, they're
Right.
way down. And nobody's actively using them on a regular basis. So if we want kids to use them on a regular basis, they need to be stored in a way that's accessible and that children are actually encouraged to use. And I always think if we're going to take the time to make it, let's make it usable. Um,
Mhm.
so that can be a lot of things. I mean, I tend to go with the most simple way. Whatever your learning environment is, that for kids to put it in a place that they can find it and use it easily, preferably put it in a place that kids can actually add to it. And so that it really is a shared document, like we would want it to be in the classroom where we're revisiting and adding over time.
So
Yeah.
interactivity is important to think about regardless of the platform.
Interactivity, ownership, revisiting,
Mhm.
reminding that it's there and that it's a resource that has been created. But I think if kids are part of building or making something, they're more likely to use it. I think the example you gave of the word list that's just like in the front of everybody's writing journal all year long, that you say, oh, it's there. Or even a chart on the wall, it just becomes decoration if you're not using it regularly. So for me, what matters most is that you're using it, you're revisiting it. It's sort of an active and living document that
Mhm.
that's useful to children. Otherwise, it's just sort of background or an activity to do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Are there any other like tips or tricks that you can share for remote teaching settings that can help grow students' vocabularies?
So, of course, encouraging children to read if they're reading independently as much as they can, and to encourage them to read some. We're making suggestions, of new and challenging texts because we do learn words as we read. Right. So if we understand most of the words, one thing that we do is we start to pick up some meaning from some of the words we don't know as readers. Um, Definitely trying to make some time for interactions around text. So even if the read part has to be audio recorded ahead of time, coming together to then discuss certain pages is one way to make it just a little more interactive. I
Mhm.
really think interactive read alouds are a special time that we should try to make time for in the synchronous, because there's some evidence it's the interactions around text that support vocabulary and comprehension.
Mhm.
Um, you learn a little bit just from listening, but you learn even more if you get to discuss.
Yes.
So I would really be encouraging teachers to try to make that a precious time in whatever synchronous time that there is, so that it is still happening regularly for kids. I actually just recently recorded an interactive read aloud with some kids that Heinemann hopefully is going to release soon. Um, just to sort of model how a lesson that we recorded in a classroom earlier could be moved to an online environment, and we could still try to do some of the similar goals for the lesson. Um, and then I think all of the big ideas about vocabulary development remain, right? Including that we learn new words when we learn new things. So, there is this idea that time is limited, so we should somehow skip science, skip social studies for right now. And I would just try to encourage as much as possible that we still are trying to have kids learn new things, because that's when the new words are going to come up, right? New books,
Right.
new ideas. Um, we should do those things anyway because it's just good for kids and it keeps them excited and enthusiastic, but also it will grow their vocabulary. And if we
Mhm.
start skipping read alouds or skipping content area learning, there's not a lot of opportunity for new vocabulary to enter the environment, right? And that is the starting point. We can't really discuss words that never come up. So we need them We need the books. We need the new learning of new ideas.
I couldn't agree more. So you're preaching to the choir on that one. Well, thank you so much for talking with me today. And for anyone who hasn't seen it yet, this is just such a great book. I love the Classroom Essentials series. I was so excited to see one on vocabulary development. So thank you for chatting with me today. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to wish you a happy Thanksgiving, even though this is going to be live after Thanksgiving. So, and Happy New Year too.
Thanks for talking to me.
Wonderful. Have a good afternoon. Take care. Bye-bye.